Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into today's podcast episode, I'm not going to ask you to like and subscribe to the podcast, but what I am going to ask you is if you would be willing to share an episode of the podcast with your friends, your colleagues, your students, if you're a teacher. I don't care which episode, pick one that you found most impactful or you think somebody else might really benefit from, and you can share it on social media. You can directly send it to somebody. Just pick somebody and share an episode, and I would appreciate it so much just to help spread the word and hopefully help somebody else with an issue that they might need some advice or some input on. So now we're going to get into today's podcast episode. This is a little bit of a different style today because I'm going to do a recap of a conference that I just got back from. So last week I was at the PAMA International Symposium in Washington, D.C. PAMA is the Performing Arts Medicine Association. So I think a lot of you have heard of me talk about other conferences that I attend really regularly, IADMS being the probably one I've been going to the longest. So that's the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science. And I attend that conference pretty much annually. And then some other ones, Healthy Dancer Canada, some of those conferences as well. But this was the very first time that I had been to a PAMA conference. And I was really excited because it encompasses all of performing arts medicine. So there is certainly a large dance component, and a lot of the people who attend the PAMA conference that are from sort of the dance world are similar people who would go to an IADMS conference. So I had lots of friends that were there. I knew lots of people who were going to be there. But it also had a lot of representation from other areas of the performing arts. So there was a much bigger representation from circus arts at PAMA than maybe at other conferences I go to. And so I was super interested in that. I treat a lot of circus artists. We don't have a huge circus community in Vancouver, but I do treat lots of people from that community. So I was really interested in that, but also other performing arts. So there was a lot of music and voice and what else was there? Musical theater, so Broadway performers and high school, like marching band and things like that, which was so cool to see because, like I said, at the dance medicine conferences, we do get a little bit of representation from maybe circus or maybe Broadway and things, but it is very heavily dance focused and often very kind of conservatory dance focused as well. So I was excited to have an opportunity to go and experience a different conference with different people and a little bit more of a robust kind of audience in terms of who the presentations were on. So what I want to do today is just kind of have a little recap of some common themes that came up in the conference. I've done this before when I've come back from my IADMS conferences, and it's always been really popular podcast episodes, especially I think amongst clinicians who maybe have not been able to make it to these conferences. I think a lot of people like to hear sort of what's been going on. So I thought I would do just a little recap, certainly not going through like every single thing that was happening, but just some common themes that came up throughout the conference with presentations. So the theme, like the overall conference theme this year was safeguarding performance, advocating for occupational health within the performing arts. So that was certainly a theme, and I'm going to talk more about this in a second, but that was certainly a theme throughout the entire conference from the keynote addresses and things like that. I will preface this by saying that I did go to mostly dance and circus related presentations. I did not attend very many of the music and vocal and those types unless it was panels that were represented. So there was like an incredible panel on menopause and performing artists that included voice and included dance and like included it all. So I did attend a lot of those panel things, but otherwise I will preface this by saying it was very dance and circus heavy just given what my kind of clinical practice is. I also had the opportunity while I was there to present on periodization in dance and like practical considerations for implementing it, especially in like studio settings and community settings. And so that was actually one of the themes. I guess the first theme I'll talk about that came up was a lot of presenting and discussions around the idea of periodization, which you have all heard me talk about tons on this podcast before. I've done full episodes on it. I will link those in the show notes if you're interested in more in depth, but also the idea of training load and training load management, which kind of falls hand in hand with periodization. All of it involves like the planning of workloads for dancers. So that was certainly a theme that came up in presentations of really looking at where are we and what are we doing in terms of structuring dancers' schedules and workloads around what we know to be best practice to decrease the burden of injury on these dancers. I had some really incredible conversations with colleagues from around the world on this topic as well. So it is certainly something that is gaining like a little bit more traction. We're still not seeing it be implemented like across the board. It's not standard. It's not like common knowledge within the dance industry yet, but it is starting to gain a bit of traction. And there was definitely a lot of discussion about it. And it was one of the themes that came up. One of the presentations was super interesting, looking at, oftentimes we talk about doing preseason screening on dancers. Screening was a really popular topic, I don't know, a bunch of years ago on the conference circuit. And a lot of places are implementing screening, which is great, but a lot of places are implementing it as like right at the beginning of a year. And so one of the presentations from a group in New York was looking at what if we change the timing of when we actually implement our screenings so that we can better or have better influence on some of these workload aspects of dancers. So maybe if we do screenings before they go on to their off season and then can give them ideas of what they should be working on and then, sort of adjust their training loads coming into their preseason based on those things that we found, maybe changing the timing of that is something that is potentially simple to do, but may have profound impacts. So just lots of ideas around periodization and workload and fitness and timing of workloads and things like that. So that was really great to see, because anybody who's listened to this podcast for any length of time knows that that's one of the things that I really do like talking about a lot and am passionate about. And I think we can make really significant changes within the dance world relatively easily by changing some simple things around workload management with dancers. Like I said, the overall theme of the conference was advocating for occupational health within the performing arts. And one of the keynote addresses was given by Dr. Ramachandran, who is from the Bloomberg School of Public Health, which is actually where the conference was held. So it was in Washington, D.C., and it was at the Bloomberg School, which is a division of Johns Hopkins University. And so he presented on it was a great presentation, and essentially presented on the fact that like occupational health and safety, so OHS, for those of you who have maybe been in like industrial settings and stuff before and have heard that terminology, he presented on how like occupational health and safety has really ignored the performing arts. And likewise, the performing arts has really ignored occupational health and safety as well. And for those of you who don't know, this is like a little bit of an aside, but it'll make sense in a minute. For those of you who don't know, years ago, I actually worked at a lumber mill for quite a few years. I actually don't know how many years I worked there for. And it was just a little side gig that I did. I was still working in performing arts. I was still working like in private practice. But a colleague of mine had previously done this role and she was transitioning into something else. And so she sort of said, hey, do you want this role? It's 3 hours a week. Like, this is the deal. And essentially this lumber mill that's local to us had a on-site workplace health program. And so they brought in a physiotherapist once a week for treatments, like for 3 hours for treatments. They had a chiropractor who came in once a week, and they had a massage therapist who came in once a week. And these services were available to the workers. They just had to sign up. There was like a weekly sign-up sheet, and they would sign up for sort of a treatment slot. And so I the treatments I was providing were not that different than, working in a private clinic or things like that. But it was good exposure for me into a more like industrial setting that really follows and takes very seriously occupational health and safety. Excuse me, because as you can imagine, a lumber mill, huge, heavy equipment, machinery, really high risk environment and high risk for like catastrophic injuries if they are not following appropriate protocols, but also a lot of like lower risk as well in terms of loud noise exposure, repetitive movements, and things like that. So they really had, I would say, a fairly robust like occupational health and safety program and did a lot of this, safety assessments and risk management and risk mitigation and all of that. And so I am fairly familiar with that model of how a lot of workplaces will assess risk and look at health and safety. And so this presentation, this keynote was so interesting to me because he basically just came out and said, like, why does occupational health and safety ignore performing arts? And why does performing arts ignore occupational health and safety? And it was so interesting because having worked in like those environment or that environment previously, and then having worked in performing arts, I never really considered, an overlap between them or how we should be working together. And so, yeah, it was just a little bit eye-opening for me and also got me thinking, why is it that we don't treat these workplaces similarly? Why are we not doing like health or like safety risk assessments and things like that within the performing arts? And I don't think there's a simple answer necessarily, but I have some ideas. And I think one of the things that is probably the biggest barrier or one of the biggest barriers is just the lack of regulation and standardization within the performing arts. And so when we think about occupational health and safety, oftentimes these things are being implemented in environments that are highly regulated. And so there's really logical steps and procedures and like policies that you go through to implement these programs. And those may be union environments. They often are union environments, but they don't have to be. But they are highly regulated in terms of how their systems and stuff work. And for any of you guys who have spent any amount of time in the performing arts world, you will know that is not the case. When we're working with creatives and we're working with, people from the arts realm, there is often not a lot of policy and procedure and kind of like systemization and things like that. It tends to be like a little bit more chaotic. And I do think some of that comes down to just like there isn't standards or regulation within it. There may be sectors within the performing arts where it would be easier to implement these things. And the first thing that comes to my mind would be something like a Broadway type show that is a resident show in a theater where you have a much more controlled environment. Like that show might run for years. And so that allows you the opportunity to come in and to do kind of OHS assessments and sort of build programs around that and have like really robust policies and procedures. But that becomes very, very, very challenging and tricky when you have a one-off show that's happening, or it's just like a community studios recital that's a one-off thing, or, all of the other varied environments that performing arts are happening in. So, excuse me, there's certainly challenges in terms of implementing it. But I think it was great to get the conversation started and to start to look at some of those things. The other thing that I found just, interesting and got me thinking again, and this is something I've actually been thinking about for a long time, and this was just another way of thinking about the same thing. But Dr. Ramachandran introduced a kind of like OHS model that sometimes they use, and it's like an inverted pyramid. So this is going to make more sense if you could visually see it, but I'm going to do my best to describe this to you. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have like the narrowest part. So it's inverted. So the widest part is at the top, narrowest at the bottom. And so this pyramid is going from the bottom of things that are least effective in terms of risk reduction or risk management when it comes to OHS stuff. And then as you move up the pyramid, we move more towards things that are most effective. So least effective at the bottom, most effective at the top. And then, like I said, inverted pyramid. So smallest sections at the bottom, biggest at the top. That makes sense. So in this pyramid at the bottom, in this model, the bottom kind of like block of the pyramid is PPE. So that stands for personal protective equipment. And so in more industrial settings, that can be things like safety goggles, or it might be ear protection or things like that. And in the performing arts, we may not have as many of those things, although he used a lot of examples from the music world. And so if you're playing in an orchestra or just environments where you're being exposed to a lot of like loud noise over time, that can cause hearing loss and hearing damage. And so looking at, okay, could we use PPE? Can we use ear protections that does not change the sound of the music, so it doesn't alter it or distort it. So there may be levels of PPE that we can implement, but from a dance world, or from my lens, what I started thinking about is a lot of this like PPE stuff is things that we put the onus on the individual, either worker or in this case, dancer. And so this might be PPE stuff like the use of knee pads or things like that, external supports and stuff like that. But I also think that this level applies to all the other things that we spend a long time talking about in terms of like injury prevention and injury risk reduction with, making sure that the dancer's warming up properly, making sure that they're cross-training and things like that. And so although they're not personal protective equipment, it is protecting that individual against, injury risk, or trying to reduce that individual's injury risk. And like I said, in this model, the things at the bottom are the least effective in terms of, how much overall effect we can have. The next rung up is administrative controls. So these would be things like being able to change schedules and influence workloads of our dancers. And so things like implementing periodization or having maximum amounts of hours that a dancer can dance in a day and things like that. So things that come from a more management level, so administrative type controls. And in some places in the dance world, we're starting to make headway into implementing some of these administrative controls. And then in some environments, these absolutely do not exist yet. So we're starting to move up into that second layer or second rung in the dance world. But then above that, we have the next rung is engineering controls. The next rung above that, or the next level, is substitution. So actually like removing a risk and substituting it with something else completely. And then the top one is elimination. Can we fully eliminate the risk? And those top three levels, we really don't touch the surface of in the dance world, apart from potentially engineering controls. They're, sprung flooring would be an example of that. So like that would be sort of an engineering control. Or there are some companies that are looking at modifying footwear for dancers. So that would be an engineering control as well. So we might be starting to move into that, but we really don't spend a lot of time or really acknowledge any of the sort of top rungs of this inverted pyramid, the ones that potentially have the ability to be the most effective. So I don't have any solutions for us right now necessarily, but I just thought it was interesting that, these models that exist and are proven and are, accepted worldwide in terms of occupational health and safety really aren't being applied to the dance world specifically at this point, but I'd go out on a limb and say the performing arts world, other than, maybe we're starting to address the very, very bottom of those pyramids with some of that like individual PPE, we'll call it, or those administrative controls. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this sort of like theme of occupational health and wellness, but I thought it was really interesting because I think it's just a different way of thinking about it that we in the dance world do not think about. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not addressing things in these ways, because in other industries, this would just be the standard. All right, I'm going to move on. So next theme that came up was there was a lot of discussion all around concussions, which was quite exciting to see, again, in the performing arts. So I might actually do a complete separate podcast episode just on concussions and dancers and all of those types of things. But the thing I want to like bring up or bring to your attention, especially for the clinicians out there who might not have heard of it yet. But most people who work in sporting or athletic populations are probably familiar with the international consensus statements on concussion in sport, and most recently the 6th international consensus statement on concussion in sport was released. That's hard to say. And I believe the 6th statement was released in 2023. And so this is a whole bunch of international organizations and all like experts in concussion, but also like sport governing bodies and organizations like the IOC and like FIFA and things like that come together and have these consensus statements on what we know about concussion, what is like the best, management and assessments and all of that. And so that was released, like I said, in about 2023. And the thing that was really cool this year is that very recently, within I want to say the last 2 months, so like super, super recently, there has been a consensus statement that has been adapted from that international one specifically for circus, which was really cool. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to implement that within the circus arts, and it's been adapted to also incorporate performance aspects, because as we all know, performing is not necessarily the same as like competition in sport. And so it includes and takes into consideration things like being able to perform with like varying lights on stage and with costumes and like all sorts of things. So it actually is a little bit, it has the sport specific consensus statement has like 6 stages, and the concussion one actually has 8 stages. So I will put a link to all of these in the show notes. So if you are interested in specifically looking at the adapted circus guidelines, there's also been adapted dance guidelines as well. So like I said, there was lots of great presentations on concussions, return to play guidelines for trapeze artists, considerations for kids in concussion, like all sorts of stuff. But it was definitely a theme this year. And the one thing I really want to draw your attention to, again, for clinicians out there, hopefully you guys are all familiar with the SCAT-6, and that is the assessment tool that we should be using for baseline testing as well as for assessing concussions. So that, again, is like a clinician tool, and I'm sure you are all sort of familiar with it. And so that is totally valid in performing artists as well. You can vary a few of the questions. So instead of asking what the score is, you could ask, like what act are you performing right now or things like that. But other than that, it is valid. But the thing that I wanted to bring to your attention, especially if you are a teacher or a studio owner or even a parent who might want to go to your studio and say, hey, what about this, is the CRT-6, which is the concussion, what does it stand for? CRT-6. Essentially what it is it is a tool to decide whether an athlete, or in this case, a dancer, has potentially sustained a concussion. And this tool is actually developed for the layperson. So the dance teacher, the studio owner, anybody who might be around this performing artist can use this tool to decide if we are concerned about a concussion and therefore need to seek medical attention or medical recognition. And so somebody at the conference brought up the idea that every studio should have the CRT-6 in the studio somewhere, whether it's posted or whether it's just available in a staff room or whatever. It should be printed out and available in every single studio. And I had never thought about that before. Recognition tool, that's what it stands for. Concussion Recognition Tool 6, CRT-6. I'm like good with acronyms and not always with their long form names. Anyway, sorry. So to have these available for studios and for teachers to be able to use, it is very straightforward. If you read through it once, you'll understand. It's essentially checklists of symptoms, and that's broken down into categories to be able to decide. Because as a dance teacher or a studio owner or a parent, you are not a medical professional, and we don't expect you to be able to medically assess a concussion necessarily. However, you do want to be able to recognize whether one has happened. So if you have a dancer who, maybe fell from a lift and hit their head on the floor, or maybe they just whipped their head back really far and they didn't actually have a blow to the head, but there was some sort of a whiplash type motion that maybe then they're complaining about symptoms and you're like, ooh, like, could that possibly be a concussion? This is a really great tool to have. And so, like I said, the idea being brought up that like every studio should just print this out and have this is not something that had crossed my mind before. And I could not agree more. So this is your call to print out this tool. It is really easily available online. If you just Google CRT6, it comes up. It is a PDF. It was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, so that might also help you find it. But you can just print it and have it anywhere in your studio. So every studio and like athletic, sporting organizations and things like that should all have it as well. But dance studios, or if you're a circus school or whatever you are, I would strongly encourage you to have a copy of this and have your teachers go through it and know that it exists and where it is and how to use it, so that if they are worried about or suspecting any sort of a concussion or head injury with a dancer, they have a checklist to be able to use. And this brings me to my last point for today. And that was also the idea. There was a lot of discussion around sort of emergency action plans and emergency response within dance studios. And again, this goes a little bit hand in hand with occupational health and safety. This would be part of an emergency action plan at a work site that, you would know exactly what to do. And in the dance world, it is very rare for studios to have a, sort of laid out or documented emergency action plan. It is, I will also go out on a limb and say, fairly rare for studios to even have dance teachers who are first aid trained or first aid qualified. And that might not be across the board, but I know plenty of studios that don't actually require their teachers to have first aid training. To me, that's not acceptable. We're dealing with dancers who are dancing at high levels. They're high-level athletes. They're putting themselves in risky environments, especially if you're doing any sort of acrobatics or tricks or tumbling or anything like that. At a bare minimum, I think that all dance teachers should be required to have basic first aid. However, that is not a requirement, partly due to the lack of regulation within the dance industry, but individual studios can require that of their staff. And I know some that absolutely do. And then I know other studios that are kind of like, oh, it's up to you. Like, we'd like it if you had it, but we're not going to require it. So just something to think about. And if you're a parent, maybe to ask your studio about, like, who are the first aid qualified people here? Because sometimes just that question gets the studios thinking like, oh, wait a second, I don't know if anybody here has first aid. So thinking about which personnel are first aid qualified, but then also having studio-specific or dance company-specific emergency action plans for if something happens. That is not just like, oh, this person's taken first aid. That is your studio's policy. So that if something happens and you end up having to call 911 or call an ambulance or, things like that, that everybody who is in that studio, like the teachers, the administrators, whoever, know what the procedure is. So who's notifying the parents, what is happening with all the other children, what, just all of those steps. And again, this is something that I think a lot of dance studios have not necessarily thought about or planned for, but they should absolutely have these emergency action plans in place, and not just for concussions. Like, yes, concussions can be a medical emergency. Also, last week's podcast episode was on heat illnesses in dance. So you could potentially end up with a dancer with like heat stroke that becomes a medical emergency. But we also have dancers who maybe have seizure disorders or diabetes or things like that. Or then we have our musculoskeletal type injuries, like somebody lands funny from a jump and breaks their ankle, or they dislocate their knee, or things like that. So things happen in a dance studio, and we want to make sure that everybody knows what their role is and that there is a emergency action plan in place. And ideally, that's been sort of like role played, although that might be going a bit far to assume that all studios are going to do that. But the more comfortable you are, like when I used to work as a sideline physio in sport, we did a lot of running through scenarios and role playing so that when and if an emergency happened on the field, you can go a little bit into autopilot. You know exactly what you're doing. You don't kind of panic and have to be like, okay, what's my role in this situation? So I think that's something that, again, we don't think about enough in the performing arts world. We see it more in some of the higher risks. So I know like Cirque du Soleil shows and stuff, like they absolutely have this stuff in place. But what about our community circus schools? Do they have those procedures in place? Some of them probably do, but I don't know if all of them do. And then again, down to our community dance studios, what are their policies and procedures that are in place? All right. That's all I'm going to say about the conference. If anybody has specific questions about anything to do with it, please feel free to reach out to me. I mean, it's 4 days jam-packed of all sorts of presentations. So I did not get to everything and obviously wasn't able to like fully give you a full rundown of everything that was happening. But those were some really common themes that were coming up day in and day out that I thought were interesting and things that we maybe can just start to think about and start to incorporate into the dance world. My final thought on the conference was, it was so nice to get to meet some of my internet friends, internet besties in real life. That honestly is one of the biggest benefits and probably the biggest benefit for me of going to these events. One of my clients yesterday in the clinic kind of asked like, oh, do you like have to pay for all of these conferences? Because you go to a lot of them and it must get really expensive. And yes, we do pay to go. And it does get a little bit expensive, but to me, it's absolutely worth it because I think working in the performing arts, and especially in the dance world, sometimes it can feel a little bit lonely if you're sort of, working in your own little silo and with your own dancers and artists. And to go to these conferences and get to chat and network and problem solve and collaborate with all of these other practitioners from all over the world who are doing really, really similar work in their own communities is actually so beneficial. And so that is, like I said, probably the number one thing I get out of these conferences. And the internet has been amazing for creating these connections. And so I have loads of people that I feel like I know really well online. There was Danelle Dixon was at this conference. She's actually from Washington, D.C., so she was there. And we've collaborated on a bunch of different things online over the years. Like for years, we've known each other and we've worked on projects together. But this was the first time we actually got to meet in person and actually hug and go for dinner. And anyway, it was fabulous. So no matter what field you're in, and if you are a dance teacher or a studio owner, I know there's lots of like conferences available to you guys as well for continuing education, and they are pricey and sometimes they're hard to get to, but there is huge value in going to these, especially if you're feeling a little bit stuck or a little bit, burnt out or just a little bit like, oh, yeah, I don't know, just a little bit stuck in what you're doing. Attending an event like a conference or things like that can really have an impact in terms of changing your perspective or just creating those connections and feeling a little bit less alone. So huge shout out to everybody that I got to see in person. The next conference I will be attending and presenting at is the IADMS conference. It is in September in Las Vegas. You'll hear me talk more about it on the podcast. So I'm really looking forward to reconnecting with a lot of the people that I just saw in Washington, D.C., and then also lots of my colleagues who weren't there as well. So if you have any questions about conferences or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me. And I would also love to hear your thoughts on this idea of implementing occupational health and safety into the performing arts industry, because to me, it is, sort of a crossover that I didn't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about previously, and now it's really got me thinking a lot more about that. So would love to hear your thoughts. All my contact information is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.